Epirus is a confusing place. Whether that be in ancient times or even in our modern day, the question about who the Epirotes were still persists. Ancient Greek sources call them barbarians more than anything else, but also describe them with a lot of Greek characteristics, such as language, religion, government, and shared history. It is actually very similar to how the Macedonians were seen as a kind of semi-outsiders. This partially explains why Macedonia and Epirus have such a deeply entwined history. Most people who are fascinated with ancient history will know about Epirus and his campaign against the Romans in the Italian peninsula. But before him was a long line of kings of the Aeacid monarchy, which now remains relatively unknown. In the early period of Epirote history, the region was extremely fragmented, where Epirote tribes not only vied for power against one another, but also for many external threats such as the Greeks, Illyrians, and Macedonians. It is with this earliest known period of Epirote history that I will focus on today. Epirus before the reign of King Alexander I of Epirus. I would like to preface this video with the fact that this topic is extremely complicated, and nearly every aspect of it is being debated amongst historians even today. So if you want to sound smart, you could at any time pause this video and say, it's actually more complicated than that, and you will probably be right. And if you want to read more about this topic on your own, I've cited the sources that I've used in the video description. In this early history of Epirus, from before the 5th to the middle of the 4th centuries BC, the name Epirus was an exonym which described a geographical location given by the Greeks. It was not a local name. This is because during the age of Greek colonization in the West, the safest route to travel from mainland Greece to southern Italy or Sicily was to travel along the coast up to the island of Corcyra, then cross the Strait of Otranto, and then continue sailing along the coast to their destination. So when the Greeks set up a colony on Corcyra, an island, they created a word to describe the mainland opposite from it. And because most names are not very imaginative, Epirus literally translates to mainland, and its inhabitants, Epirotes, mainlanders. But initially, this was strictly a geographical descriptor. Depending on what source you read, there are anywhere between 7 to 14 minor tribes which inhabited Epirus. But there are only really 3 major tribes that matter for the purposes of this video: the Thesprotians, the Chaonians, and the Molossians. The Thesprotians were the closest tribe to the Greek world, and so were the first to establish regular relations with them. The most important of which was Ambracia, a Corinthian colony which acted as a center for trade, a port, and a mint for the Epirote tribes. Within Thesprotia was the sanctuary at Dodona, which had the second most important oracle in the Greek world after the Pythia at Delphi, and was famed throughout the Greek world. Citizens from across Greece came to Dodona, no doubt making the sanctuary rich, but also allowing for cultural diffusion between the Greeks and the Thesprotians who shared in the Greek religion. As a consequence of this, at least in early Epirus, the Thesprotians were the most Hellenized Epirote tribe. Their capital was the city of Gitana, although this was not a Greek-style city-state, but rather just an administrative center for the Thesprotian Federation and its tribal assembly. Thesprotia was made up of many other sub-tribes, which each had their own local ways of governance. This made it a tiered governmental system, and this is similar to Greek leagues such as the Aetolian League. This was an advanced system of governance for these supposed barbarians, and this system can be found throughout Epirus. The Chaonians were by far the most powerful of the three main Epirot tribes. From the 5th to the early 4th centuries, this was because of their military prowess, as attested to by Thucydides during the Peloponnesian War, where they were hegemons over all of Epirus. Their military skill may be because of their northern location, directly bordering the Illyrians, who launched countless raids and incursions against their southern neighbors. The Chaonians were not only the bulwark against the Illyrians for Epirus, but alongside the Macedonians in the east, defended all of Greece. Despite being so far north and isolated from mainland Greece, they still came into contact with the Greeks, most commonly through the island of Corcyra. Their capital was the city of Phoenike, which, like the Thesprotians, was the center for a tribal assembly, rather than a seat for a monarchy, and had a number of subtribes which had their own governments acting on a local level. The only one of these major tribes which had a monarchy is by far the most important one, the Molossians, who would one day unite all of Epirus under the Molossian crown and help to create a unified Epirot identity. So it is predominantly on the Molossians and their Aeacid dynasty that I will focus on today. So who were the Molossian monarchs? Well, they claim a legendary lineage which traces back to their ancient founder, Molossus, son of Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, a major figure in Greek mythology surrounding the Trojan War. This story was generally accepted by the Greeks, and this tying of one's own history to a legendary Greek past is often one of the first steps a culture takes in Hellenization. Other examples include the Macedonian Argead dynasty, who claim to be descendants of Hercules, or even with Rome, whose legendary founding claims that Romulus and Remus were descendants of Aeneas of the Trojan War. The role of the Molossian monarch was to act as a head of state, but they were not responsible for much of the day-to-day runnings of the kingdom. Instead, that role was given to the prostatus, the chief magistrate under the king, who was annually elected along with a grammatius, the secretary. These elections occurred on the federal level, but we do not have specifics for how the voting process worked. Below them were a council of 10 demiorgoi, who made up the tribal council. Each one was a representative for one of the kingdom's sub-tribes, and were annually elected on the local level rather than the federal. Much like Epirot history as a whole, however, the role of the demiorgoi becomes more varied and nuanced as time goes on, with their name changing to Synarchontes and later Hiram Mnemones, and their numbers grew from 10 to 15 with the expansion of the Molossian state. But for our purposes here, the point of interest is with the local elections, which imply another level of political organization underneath the federal level, which can also be seen in the other major Epirot tribes. What makes Molossia unique, however, is underneath this sub-tribal level were individual communities such as cities, which themselves had their own political institutions. And in the future, when the other major tribes were brought into the Molossian state, it added yet another layer to this political organization: federal, tribal, sub-tribal, and community. This multi-tiered system is quite complex, especially when compared to the Greek city-states and even Greek leagues. This complicated system may very well be the reason why Epirus was able to eventually unify into a single state, while the Greeks themselves could not. But what did this Molossian expansion look like? And what did Epirus look like as a whole from the 5th to the middle of the 4th centuries BC? Well, the first Molossian king that we have any actual information on is Admetus, although all we know of his reign is a single story. After the second Persian invasion of Greece, Themistocles, an Athenian general and statesman, was ostracized from Athens. He was then on the run from the Spartans, and soon after that, the Athenians as well. His flight originally took him to Argos, but he had to flee and eventually made his way to Corcyra, although he had to flee the island as well, because nowhere in Greece was safe for him, because no Greek state would refuse his powerful pursuers. His last-ditch attempt was to go on to Molossia and meet with King Admetus. The only problem with this is that during Themistocles' rule in Athens, he had slighted the Molossian king, who was not likely to forgive him. He humbly urged Admetus, who was surprisingly pleased with his supplication, and when Themistocles' pursuers caught up with him in Molossia, the king turned them away, gave Themistocles money, and then allowed him to escape east to Macedonia and eventually make his way to the Persian court. Despite being a short one, the Greeks and the later Romans really liked this story, and it was told for centuries to come. A large reason for this is that it has the powerful theme of foregoing vengeance and instead replacing it with goodwill. This story, through its positive portrayal of the Molossian king, yet further brings them into the Greek world in the minds of the Greeks. We then don't hear of Epirus again until the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century BC. The ruler of Molossia at the time was the son of Admetus, the boy king Tharips, who, because of his young age, had a regent named Sabalinthus. At the outbreak of the war, the 3 Epirote tribes were on the side of Ambracia, a former colony of Corinth and ally of the Spartans. This is largely because the Epirotes had a close economic relationship with the city and would benefit from its success. Ambracia wanted to campaign against the Acarnanians, their long-term rivals, and so they gathered an army. Importantly for this video, they called upon the hegemons of Epirus, the Chaonians, who brought with them an army made up of all 3 major Epirote tribes. Without going into too much detail, this campaign went poorly, with much of the blame on the failure being placed on the overeager barbarian Chaonians. Both the Ambracians and the Chaonians suffered heavily, and this defeat paved the way for Molossia to surpass a now weakened Chaonia. Molossia, now broken free of Chaonian hegemony, broke their support for Ambracia, and therefore also with Sparta. They sent their child king, Tharips, to Athens, where he was treated with respect, educated, and given an honorary Athenian citizenship. The Athenians were all too happy to have influence over this foreign king, and our ancient sources say that upon his return, he was the first to bring order, Greek customs, Greek language, and civilized ways back to Molossia. This is more than likely a Greek over-exaggeration of their impact, as Hellenization had already begun long before the reign of King Tharips. But his Athenian education no doubt expedited this process. After Tharips' death, he was succeeded by his son, Alcetas I. We do not know much about the beginning of his reign, but after the defeat of the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War, Molossia was left without a strong ally to back their king. This explains how, in the early 4th century BC, Alcetas I was expelled and the Molossian throne was left vacant. During this time, the 2 most powerful states in the Greek world were Sparta on the Greek mainland and Syracuse in Sicily. Both had fought against the Athenians and won, and so, after their victory, they did not want to fight another devastating war against one another. With that being said, they were competitors, with each side trying to expand their influence, like the Americans and the Soviets during the Cold War. This meant that the now exiled Alcestis I was easily able to find refuge in Syracuse at the court of Dionysius I. At this point, Dionysius had cemented his control over Sicily and southern Italy, and wished to gain influence and control in mainland Greece. This opportunity came with Alcestis I. He was made a citizen of Syracuse and was even adopted by the brother of Dionysius. Athens as well honored him with a citizenship as they had done for his father. The exiled king was important for both of these powerhouses, as Athens was trying to bring the Syracusans into their orbit, and the Syracusans were trying to gain power in the traditionally Spartan-allied land of Epirus. They were both using the exiled king to politically outmaneuver the Spartans. In 385 BC, Dionysius would launch an invasion of Molossia in order to reinstall Alcestis I on the throne. This was done by a predominantly Illyrian force, which was spearheaded by 2,000 Syracusan soldiers. This army marched south and made quick work of the Molossians, reinstalling Alcestis on the throne. The invading army, however, went further south and were eventually defeated by a Spartan intervention. Despite this defeat, Alcestis I remained on the Molossian throne. The casualty figures given by ancient sources are that 15,000 Molossians were killed. This number is estimated to be much too large for just the Molossian tribe, and so modern historians believe that this is evidence for the expansion of the Molossian state during the end of Tharp's reign and the beginning of Alcestis's. So rather than looking like this during the Aeacid Restoration, the Molossians were hegemons over the region, taking that privilege from the Chaonians. After regaining the throne, Alcestis had an unexpectedly free hand to do as he wished, because his Syracusan benefactor was preoccupied in a war with Carthage, and could not press their influence over the Molossians. Alcestis instead strengthened Molossia's ties to Athens, joining the Second Athenian League in 375 BC. In 373 BC, they aided the Athenians in the crossing to relieve the Corcyraeans from a siege by the Spartans, and Alcestis even defended the Athenian general Timotheus when he was on trial in Athens. But when this Athenian alliance did not survive, the Molossians were once again left to their own devices. All of the major Greek powers at this point were severely weakened, and Molossia now turned its attention to expanding against its neighbors. By the end of his reign, Molossia had taken a sizable amount of land from their neighbors, especially the Thesprotians. Some notable conquests were a sizable coastline and Dodona, a major religious center, which only served to give the Molossians further influence in the Greek world. But the events after Alcestis's death are of great contention between modern scholars. As such, I definitely have to make some assertions that are not unanimously supported, but are what I believe to be the most accurate series of events. Alcestis I had two sons, Archibald and Neoptolemus, from two different wives. The first gave him his eldest son, Archibald, whose name is a variation of his grandfather's. This follows the Greek naming tradition. Alcestis, some time later, got a second wife and had another son named Neoptolemus. Alcestis, for whatever reason, named Neoptolemus as his successor. Maybe he thought that he would be a better king, Or maybe he just liked his second wife better. But after the king's death in 370 BC, Neoptolemus I became the sole king of Molossia. Shortly after their father's death, however, Erebos contested the succession, and eventually a compromise was made between the two in 368 BC. Both brothers would share the crown. This system worked surprisingly well and lasted until the death of Neoptolemus I in 359 BC, and Erebos became the sole king. Neoptolemus I left his son Alexander and two daughters, Olympias and Troas, behind. Erebos then married his niece, Troas, which may have been a way to improve his legitimacy on the throne by marrying his father's named heir's daughter. No matter the reason, still gross. A major problem during the reign of King Erebos was the increasing threat of the Illyrians to the north. They raided and looted much of Epirus, and despite winning a victory over the invaders, they were much too strong a force for the Molossians alone to handle. His solution lay in the east. The Macedonians were another culture which had been labeled as barbarians by the Greeks. Like the Epirotes, the Macedonians tied themselves to a Greek mythological past, played decisive roles in Greek geopolitics, were led by a king, had similar governmental structures, and bordered the Illyrians to the north. Macedonia also had the fortune of being led by King Philip II, who, because of the decline in Greek power following the Peloponnesian War, was able to expand Macedonian influence, becoming the most powerful state in the Greek world. Erebos, understandably, wanted an alliance with this rising power, and so offered Philip II the hand of his niece Olympias in marriage in 357 BC. She would go on in 356 BC to give birth to a son, Alexander III of Macedon, who would later be known as Alexander the Great. What Erebos did not expect, however, was that this alliance would be his downfall, as Philip sought to replace the Epirote king with the king's nephew, Alexander the Molossian, son of Neoptolemus I, and brother of his wife Olympias, who had now been taken in by the Macedonian court and was being groomed to take the Molossian throne with the full backing of Macedonia.